Happy April Fool's Day. This is Geography 10, Lecture 14. There were a handful of slides at the end of the last lecture that I didn't get to, but I have incorporated them into this one. So we will cover them without having to go back to that slideshow. Today, I want to talk about capitalism and colonialism. I want to describe the scramble for Africa. I want to talk about uneven development. And then at the end, if we have a chance, I want to talk a little bit about the Orwell essay that you read for today, Shooting an Elephant. Here's the update as far as readings and such. For Tuesday, I'd like you to read Chapter 2 of Delaney, the Territory book. For next Thursday, another couple sections of the Bernstein essay from your reader. On Tuesday the 13th, and this is a slight change from the syllabus. The syllabus says we would watch this movie Life and Debt on the 15th, Thursday, but we're going to have to move that up. So the movie Life and Debt will be shown in lecture on Tuesday the 13th. I will let you know next week what we're going to do on Thursday the 15th. As I said last time, there's a map quiz next week in sections on sub-Saharan Africa. The relevance of that should be obvious in terms of today's lecture. And then finally, one other note, research papers are due in lecture on April 13th. So you have another reason besides the movie to come to lecture on that day. Are there any questions? Okay. I want to start by picking up a couple of the key points from the last two lectures. We've been reading Max Weber and Karl Marx, trying to understand what capitalism is. For our purposes, the key points from those lectures from Weber, the key point is that speculation is inherent in capitalism, both rational speculation, as he defined it, and irrational speculation. From Marx, I would like you to take away as your key points the idea that the key drivers and processes, the sort of internal dynamics of capitalism, are first money as capital, that is, money used in a particular way, rather than just money in and of itself. We'll talk about that more in a moment. And the commodification of labor and land, picking up a point that we've hit a number of times this semester already. And so keeping those key points in mind, the question for today is how do these relate to colonialism and capitalism, the relationship between colonialism and capitalism. So we're going to try to understand the relationship between what happened in Europe beginning in the late 18th and early 19th century as that unfolded over the course of the 19th century, and we'll bring it up to about World War I today, and then skip ahead a little bit with Orwell. The things that happened elsewhere in the world, in places like Africa, how were they related to or driven by industrializing capitalism in Europe? This is a map depicting colonial dominion in the first half of the 18th century, so roughly 1700 to 1763. The patterns here are pretty striking. So we have England, France, Spain, and Portugal, and then, according to these, and also the Netherlands, which is barely visible here in and of itself. But the possessions that they had or claimed around the world, we see the French principally in what's now Canada and parts of the Mississippi Basin. We see, the French here principally, Louisiana, New France here, the British along the coast of what's now the United States, the Spanish in Mexico up into what's now California, down through Central America and much of the western half of South America, the Portuguese with Brazil here, also Mozambique along the coast of what's now Angola. And we can see by the underlinings that these European powers also had smaller possessions in terms of territory scattered around Southeast Asia, along the coast of Africa. And then this map blows up the picture in the Caribbean, where the different powers had rather complicated patterns of territorial influence and control on the islands of the Caribbean, the West Indies. This area, as we've already seen, dominated by sugar production, sugar plantations at that time. I want you to notice that most of Africa here is labeled as undiscovered. It's not yet fallen under the control, at least in the interior, of these European powers. Keep this map in mind as we move forward and watch the ways in which it changes between 1700 and 1900. Any questions? Here's a similar map in 1900. What kinds of things do we see? The Spanish and the Portuguese have lost their control in Latin America. These countries have gained their independence and are no longer subservient politically to Spain and Portugal. We see that the United States has booted the British out, bought the French out. Canada is still part of the United Kingdom at this point in time, or the British Commonwealth, and to that extent is still part of an imperial or colonial framework, but it's gained its own very distinct territorial boundaries. We see that the interior of Africa and the islands of Southeast Asia, India, Australia, these areas have become colonies. They have gained interior territorial boundaries. They have taken up the shape that, for the most part, many of these boundaries remain today, although they are now independent countries. Ethiopia and Liberia are the only countries in Africa at this point that have their independence. We've seen a pretty radical reconfiguration. What was once undiscovered has been effectively brought within the colonial control of the European powers. Areas that had previously been colonies have gained their independence. There's a whole slew of now 15 different European and, in one case, Asian, so Japan is there, countries that claim control of other parts of the world beyond their boundaries. Anybody notice the one United States colony that's visible on this map? Yeah, the Philippines, right there, which that happened only shortly before this time period. Any questions about that? Yeah. Is Taiwan a Japanese possession at this time? It certainly appears that way, doesn't it? Yes. I don't know the details of that history, but I believe you're correct. Any other questions? So we're interested in understanding how this happened. I'm not going to talk about the independent struggles of the Spanish colonies in Latin America, although that belongs in this subject as well. We're more interested today primarily with what happened in Africa between 1700 and 1900. So let's go back to Marx and this idea of money as capital. Marx explicitly, emphatically says in Capital Volume 1 that capital is not a thing. This is a hard thing to remember, but it's an important thing to remember. Capital, he says, is a process. So if you think for a moment that it's a pile of money that's about to be invested, yes, that's capital, but it's not the fact that it's money that makes it capital. It's the fact that it's about to be invested. It's what happens next. The process here depicted, you start with money, you convert it into commodities. That's what C stands for here. The commodities in question are of two kinds, in Marx's opinion. Labor power and means of production. That's what LP and MP stand for. You put those together, you work your way through this process of production, in which you produce more commodities. You transform these into this. And the prime is to suggest that you have produced something more or new or different from what you had before. That you take back to the market and you sell for money, more money, if everything goes according to plan, than you started with. And then the process can repeat. So we're interested in thinking about how all the pieces come together to enable this process to happen. And obviously, this formula, or sort of conceptual configuration, does not speak to questions of space at all. Yes? Raw materials are included in means of production. For Marx, the key thing here is to differentiate the labor power because that's the source of new value. Means of production includes basically everything else. It includes the machinery, the land, the raw materials, everything you need to combine with the labor power to make production happen. Now, where do those means of production come from? Where are these labor powers, these laborers who have this labor power? What happens between here where you buy the stuff that's going to go into production and here where you sell it? If you buy your means of production and your labor in one part of the world and sell the outcome at the end in another part of the world, what's happened in between? Obviously, these spatial questions are really important. How do you get the gold or the rubber or the sugar from where it's produced to where you need it, either for production or for sale? And how do those spatial configurations affect the overall working out of this formula? How does that contribute to making M prime bigger than M? These are some of the questions that we want to think about in thinking about colonialism. So this process depends on social relations being in important ways commodified. You have to bring the exchange value and the use value together in an object. Remember, that's Marx's definition of a commodity. It has both exchange value and use value. It includes, in this case, land and people. They, too, are commodified. They become things that have use value as well as exchange value. This does not necessarily mean that they're slaves, right? You can commodify a person's labor by hiring them and paying them a wage, rather than simply by owning them. Slaves are a commodity as well, but they are not the only kind of way you can commodify labor. And Marx would argue that they're a rather primitive way of commodifying labor. You make the object into property. And here we might think about Delaney, right? The property as a key dimension of the way not only things but also space, land, the oceans, can be folded into these social relations. There also, incidentally, needs to be some kind of political framework that will acknowledge, recognize those property claims, and enforce them. You encompass these pieces, these processes, in market relations. You enable them to be bought and sold, exchanged for each other, which is quite an achievement if you think about it in terms of colonialism and international trade. The market relations for these goods have got to extend across national boundaries, across entire continents and oceans, and integrate it into a market in which these price signals can operate. Now, these social relations, these commodified social relations, we might think of them not as somehow achieved once and for all and thereafter fixed and stable, but in fact, in themselves an ongoing sort of process of reproduction and change. These social relations themselves have to be produced and reproduced if they are to persist. And in a lot of parts of the world, just putting those social relations in place is a struggle that lasts hundreds of years, or at least it has or can. Any questions? So how do we make sense of this? How do we explain it? This slide is from the last lecture, actually. The idea that you amass surplus wealth in money form and other paper representations. Once you have it amassed, you can invest it in production rather than simply in trade. It involves the development of technologies to increase the rates of production driven by competition between firms, or in this case, countries, and the amassing of laborers in a coordinated fashion with work dictated by the tools and machines that they employ rather than the other way around. These are all steps or components of this larger process of producing and reproducing, maintaining these social relations. Now, this is the part I was at last time at the end of lecture and didn't quite get to. Again, thinking about this spatially, thinking about it in terms of space and time. I said last time that innovation involves somehow increasing the rate of accumulation, the rate at which you turn M into M prime. And that this is a rate measured not just in terms of profit, but in terms of time. If you can complete the process more quickly, then you have gained a competitive advantage over your competitors. You can make goods more quickly. You can also circulate them more quickly. And I brought out from Marx the phrase annihilation of space by time, the idea that capitalism has driven the production of systems of distribution and communication that shrink the world, so to speak. They bring places closer together in the sense that they make it easier to get from one to the other, to move goods from one to the other, to move information and money from one to the other. You can overcome distance in this way, and this can facilitate that acceleration in the circulation of goods, and therefore in the rate of capital accumulation. There are, so to speak, you can think of this in terms of internal and external strategies for achieving this, for achieving growth in the rate of production and surplus value accumulation. You can expand outwards to incorporate new parts of the world into your markets. And colonialism is obviously an instance of this. You can reach out and find new raw materials, new laborers, and also new markets in places that were previously beyond the reach of your markets or your productive systems. There's also an internal face to this process in which you can, so to speak, intensify production within the spaces where it already exists. You can develop new innovations, new industries. You can tear down old systems that no longer are very competitive and build new ones taking advantage of new circumstances. You can essentially find and exploit differentials within the existing geographical framework rather than simply expanding outwards. And in this respect, the built environment becomes increasingly important. We want to think about the construction of built environments in places in Europe, the factories, the railroads, the boats and shipping systems that intensify the rate at which production occurs in those places and facilitate or depend on continued interaction with faraway places that provide raw materials and markets. Primitive accumulation we've talked about before, understanding this as the production of the conditions necessary for the process that is capital to play itself out, specifically focusing on issues of land and labor. Any questions? This term, combined development, applies to most of what we will be discussing today. It refers to development that combines capitalist social relations in one place, sometimes called core economies, and here we're thinking principally of industrial urban centers in Europe and later on in North America and other places, with other kinds of social relations that aren't yet commodified in another place, and these are frequently called peripheral, and it articulates these two together. And this is important because these other kinds of social relations, and the examples given here are kin-based or tributary, can persist for a long time, even in this articulated relationship with commodified social relations in the core economies. So if we think about African societies and economies in the 19th century, we can recognize that some of them were kin-based, in which the most important relations defining people and their relationships to each other, and in many ways defining how they worked as an economy, were relationships based on kinship. So it could be your clan. It could be your lineage. These were the anthropologists have studied this to their heart's content. There's an incredible diversity of them, but they can be grouped under the notion of a kin-based economy, or a kin-based social system, the economy being incorporated into that. Tributary is a system in which the defining relations of the economy are those of tribute, basically, in which certain people pay tribute to other people, political leaders. They might be local or they might be further afield, but the relationship of domination is sort of strictly political, and the economy is incorporated into that. You haven't got a separate market that operates according to its own logic. You have a political system of domination in which certain people are simply in power, and they extract tribute from the people who produce it. Produce whatever it is. Food is typically the major one. Those systems, and again, they're very diverse, and they're sort of conveniently grouped under these headings, can actually produce surpluses that can then be fed into more commodified social relations in other parts of the world. So the extraction of rubber from the Belgian Congo, which we'll talk about shortly, is an example of this. The people in the Belgian Congo who actually went and got the rubber were not wage laborers. They were not being paid for their time. They were simply required, as a condition of their being there, to turn over a certain amount of rubber every month to the Belgian colonial officials. This was a kind of tribute, essentially. They were not technically slaves, because they were not themselves bought and sold as people. They did not belong as property to the Belgian officials. They simply had to produce a certain amount of rubber and hand it over as tribute. And that rubber went straight to Europe, where it was a commodity. But you can see that you have got an articulation between two very different sets of social relations in two very separated places. But these are extremely important, both for what happens in the Belgian Congo, and even what's still happening there today, and for what happens in Europe, courtesy of that rubber. Are there any questions? Bernstein defines imperialism as a general system of domination by a state or states of other states, regions, or the whole world. Thus, political subjugation through colonialism is only one form this domination might take. Imperialism also encompasses different kinds of indirect control. That map from 1900 depicts colonialism, which, if you recall, involves the direct political subjugation of an outside external territory. But imperialism is a broader category and does not require colonialism, although it can accompany it, and in the cases we're going to talk about today, does accompany it. But we are going to watch those sort of process of transformation as colonialism and imperialism kind of work out their different forms and relationships with each other over the course of more than a century. Other people have also written extensively about imperialism, one of them being Lenin in 1916, so not long before the completion of the Russian Revolution. He wrote a famous book about imperialism, and he made the argument that it was driven by two complementary needs. The need on the one side to find sources of raw materials and markets for European manufactured goods in ever-increasing volumes. So here we might think about the stuff, basically. Where do the raw materials come from, and where do those goods that you produce go? In order for that process to work itself out between M and C prime and M prime, you need to have a constant influx of raw materials, and you have to have a place where at the end of the day you can sell those commodities and get M prime out of it. And the nature, if you think about this, if this is a system that is constantly trying to do this, if all the production in a place like the United Kingdom is aimed towards doing this over and over and over again, it has to expand. It has to get bigger. There has to be more M prime all the time, which is going to mean more C, which is going to mean more means of production and more labor power. That expansion has to happen from somewhere and to somewhere. And this first point is about that. But Lenin also drew attention to the need to find investment opportunities that would be more profitable than those available in Europe itself. And again, think back to that process. You start with M, you end with M prime. If it works, you will constantly find yourself with more money than you started with. And the point will always be to plow that